So as Donald Trump continues to wage war in Iran, he has threatened NATO once again, although this time it does seem more serious than ever. Indeed, he is questioning America's role, its commitments, and whether the oldest and most significant alliance in history really does serve American interests in its current form. Spoiler alert, it does. But this is what matters, because while the United States president can't just leave NATO, he needs approval from Congress for that, he can still fundamentally, structurally undermine the alliance by refusing to act on its foundations, namely the Treaty of NATO, and most specifically the infamous Article 5, its core component and concept of collective defence. However, for sake of argument, what if that assumption were wrong? Not just whether could NATO exist without the United States, but what would actually be realistically a possibility based on Europe as it exists in its current form? And could it be possible if it makes a concerted effort to adapt, which, based on current trends, looks more probable than it did, say, even a few months ago? So in this video, I wanted to conduct a little bit of a thought exercise. We're going to break it down properly. Not just the surface level reaction, the hysteria of NATO's imminent implosion, NATO will fall apart, but the deeper reality based on the data and the sentiment. We'll look at the numbers, the military balance, the industrial capacity, the nuclear question, and ultimately whether Europe is actually far weaker than many claim, or is it actually stronger once you scratch beneath that surface? Because this answer is much less obvious than most will like to assume.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Pyotr here with a quick take, a new form of videos I'm introducing where I relatively just jot down some thoughts and share them with you. Now, I've made quite a few videos on NATO without the United States, or what some people call NATO minus, but I wanted to do another because of the fervour around what's being said on X and the, frankly, complete BS, especially on Twitter. NATO still has plenty of potential, plenty of potency without the United States. And don't get me wrong, I don't like saying this, but with the world as it is right now, we, at least from a European perspective, have to behave as it is, not as we'd like it to be. It simply requires the political capital, the strategic vision, and a long-term commitment, strategic patience to do so. And of course, don't get me wrong either, that this is something that can easily happen or just happen overnight. It requires a lot of things to go right. And of course, before getting into it from what I've thought about, what do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. Now, as usual, to understand this, let's go back a bit. Let's start at the beginning. NATO isn't just another alliance. It's not just a few nation states jumping together. It was built in the aftermath of the greatest single destructive experience in human history, the Second World War. A moment when Europe was absolutely exhausted, fractured, and completely flattened. The alliance brought together 12 countries at that time, 10 European and 2 North American, the United States and Canada. And its purpose was, well, perfectly summed up by the then first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, who said the infamous statement that NATO existed to simply, quote, keep the Russians or the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Now, at the time, that told you everything you needed to know. NATO wasn't merely about defence, it was about balance, the balance of power, but also the balance of deterrence, to contain Soviet power, prevent European fragmentation, and most critically, ensure that the United States stayed engaged in Europe, because the real fear wasn't just the Soviet Union. It was the fear that America would repeat what it had done after the First World War. A withdrawal, a disengagement, a sense of isolationism, and therefore leave Europe to deal with the consequences, the fallout, alone. For decades, therefore, NATO worked precisely because that didn't happen. But now, since Trump has returned to office in the past year. For a long time, those assumptions have been starting to crack and really gain a lot of momentum in the past month that Trump has gone to war with Iran and received blowback, a rejection by many nation states across Europe in wanting to engage, be them Britain saying that this isn't our war, or of course Spain most infamously denying usage of the bases. Now, the idea of US withdrawal from NATO sounds extreme, but the context is changing. The rising tensions of Greenland just earlier in the year have all obviously been forgotten or put to the back of our minds. The situation over Iran and the critical choke points on the Strait of Hormuz are completely out of control. We have no idea what's going to happen. And you have this growing shift in US strategy towards the Western Hemisphere, what we thought there was, and Trump's inconsistent statements versus his actions. The more that he continues to mention it, the more that it begins to gain legitimacy in the eyes of not just Trump, but his broader administration. The EU is quietly beginning to plan for a world where the US is non-existent, not just less predictable. And once that thinking starts, well, it never really goes away. And if anything, I think it needs to accelerate. It needs to deepen. There needs to be a coherent approach here from the different capitals across Europe. But let's deal with the most common assumption around the idea of NATO without the US, or NATO minus. That without the US, NATO would be militarily irrelevant, a paper tiger. Well, on paper, you would think that seems obvious. The US spends over 900 billion on defense. Trump wants to take it to 1.5 trillion, and that's more than the next 9 countries combined effectively. Europe collectively, though, spends roughly 400 billion. Now that's a huge gap, but it's not nothing either. Europe's defense spending combined is still the second largest in the world. By comparison, Russia spends around 140 billion, and that's in the height of its wartime economy. Normally, it was spending around 70 billion. China spends $250 billion, but there are many questions around how sustainable that is with the economy of China right now. And so, more importantly, NATO without the US is far from impotent. The remaining 31 countries still field over 1 million troops, alongside modern equipment, advanced logistics, and decades of operational experience. It's not a weak alliance, it's just a largely under-coordinated one, because the United States has taken so much of the centrality. But that distinction is critical, because if Europe is forced to coordinate more effectively, Finland comes in, the growing interoperability between the broader NATO countries, the non-major NATO allies, such as Morocco or Qatar, for example, will you pool procurement, integrate command structures, align the strategy? That 400 billion starts to look very different. And whilst the joke is that Europe likes to regulate and therefore stifle growth, there are some pretty large companies in Europe. Rheinmetall, just to mention one, in Germany, BA, Rolls-Royce, that you can't snub at. The burden is already shared more than people think. Indeed, the US and Germany each contribute roughly 16% to NATO's core budgets, followed by the UK at 11% and France at 10%. So this means, at least in purely financial terms, Europe could relatively quickly compensate for the loss of Washington's contribution. Indeed, we've seen them do that over Ukraine anyway, but we'll come to Ukraine specifically later on, so stick around for that. Now, the issue therefore isn't whether Europe can fund its defence, it's whether it chooses to. Now, that being said, this is where it does get a little bit more complicated. The technological industrial gaps, because the United States dominates the global defence industry. I mentioned Rheinmetall, but the United States has Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, and RTX, which form the backbone of NATO's technological edge. So roughly half of the world's top defense firms are American. So that means advanced stealth aircraft like the F-35, and drone systems, missile defense systems like, of course, the Patriot and THAAD, satellite intelligence. The logistics element of NATO is what I think is possibly the biggest Achilles heel right now. They're all heavily dependent on US capabilities. That would definitely hurt, but there are ways around it. Because again, the picture isn't one-sided. Europe has its own serious industrial capacity. It just has to reallocate resources and priorities. be them BAE Systems, Airbus, Thales, Saab, Rheinmetall. These are all companies that in some areas Europe actually has a comparative advantage over. And you think about, for example, warships, diesel submarines, artillery, ammunitions production. In fact, due to the war in Ukraine, Europe is already scaling up rapidly in these areas. And so what you get is a shift from technological superiority led by the US to industrial depth and mass production led by Europe. Look at what Volkswagen is doing in Germany, for example. Not as advanced in every domain, but potentially more sustainable in a prolonged conflict and much more healthy for the importance of Europe's growing need for strategic autonomy, and something those of you who are regular watchers will know I'm a huge proponent of. But there's the nuclear question, because this is the real issue. NATO without the US doesn't just lose conventional strength, it loses the nuclear umbrella. Europe relies heavily on this strategic deterrence, and without it, there's only two countries, i.e. Britain and France, which have nuclear capabilities. And it is relatively limited, but it is possible for this to be expanded. There are discussions with the Germans and the French. The British are looking at more ways to interact again with the European Union and the broader EPC, or European political community, to undertake a sort of idea of a collective security deterrence. And at the end of the day, nuclear weapons are what they are, destructive to such an extent you don't necessarily need thousands of them to do the job. With all that in mind, then, we have to consider what would potentially happen. Well, most likely, and it's happening right now, that Europe is adapting. It's just at the rate of speed that it can. It's much more about the controversiality. Countries like Germany and Poland could be forced to consider developing their own nuclear capabilities if they didn't feel comfortable enough. And that would fundamentally reshape European security and potentially make Europe more autonomous than it has ever been, but also split. These decisions require a collective front, but they are big decisions to make. Some argue Europe already has the foundations to build this credible deterrent, be that conventional or nuclear, but it has to invest and politically align properly. Some others go further, arguing that the US withdrawal won't weaken Europe. It will force it to be finally stronger in the way that it should always be. Once allies stop trusting in American guarantees, as they should have stopped using Russian cheap energy or Chinese big markets, then that will be this actual turning point. But within all of this, this is the part that I think most people miss. A NATO without the US wouldn't just be weaker, it would be fundamentally different. It would still function as NATO, but why does it have to have the United States at the core of it? NATO becomes actually far more focused if it's largely just about Europe, more regional, more concentrated on its immediate neighborhood, and therefore perhaps the most potent effects. That means things like Eastern Europe, the Eastern flank, the Arctic, and for many of you who know me, of course, right now, the war in Ukraine, because it's where things get interesting. Ukraine, with its significant population, experienced military, and hardened battlefield knowledge, would be a central pillar to a post-US NATO. Simultaneously, Europe has already more capacity than many assume. Turkey alone fields over 350 active personnel. It's the largest army in NATO after the US. Major powers like France, Germany, Poland, Italy, and the UK maintain sizable modern forces. Of course, improvements must be made. But collectively, European NATO countries field thousands of aircraft, advanced cruise missiles, modern tanks, naval assets that in some cases rival or exceed Russian capabilities. Even US forces currently stationed in Europe, around 80,000, are relatively modest compared to what European states already possess. And critically, much of the infrastructure would remain. The US maintains dozens of bases, be them air, naval, or command facilities, but they wouldn't simply disappear overnight, they would just be repurposed. So again, the question isn't really capability, it's coordination and political capital. The alliance isn't just about surviving, it's about evolving and about adapting to the reality of the situation. NATO has performed operations without the United States before. Look at the Balkans, just for one quick example. So could NATO work without the US in theory? Honestly, yes, but not in the way that we recognize. It would be less technologically dominant, less perhaps globally ambitious, more regionally focused, but more independent and actually living to what its name is about, the North Atlantic, not the global alliance. It's not about capability or resources, but as always, willingness. And the more Trump continues to push, insult, criticise and threaten, well, that may finally be the last nail in the coffin. Not for NATO to disappear, but for it to actually to reach its even better and more rapid, streamlined potential. As I like to be on this channel, a solutions-based person, some see it as an opportunity. If it uses this moment to finally do what it has avoided to do for ages, building a truly unified pan-European, pan-global Western democracies defence system under the auspices of NATO, well, it may be difficult for those who want to be part of it in the US, but it may be the best thing that Europe can do in this international disorder we're inhabiting right now. But that's it from me, everyone, in this quick take. Thanks very much for watching. Take care of the like button, do subscribe, and we'll see you all in the next one. See ya.